Welcome to Life Stories. Today's tale is one of family, betrayal, and the hard lessons that come with setting boundaries. Emily Clark had worked tirelessly to build the life she had always dreamed of, a beautiful home. But when her sister, Jessica, felt entitled to what Emily had earned, the pressure to give in became overwhelming. Join us as we explore the emotional journey that led Emily to take a stand for herself and her hard-earned peace. It's a story about choosing strength over guilt. And sometimes, losing everything to find what truly matters. Let's begin today's story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more. It was a quiet afternoon when my sister, Jessica, walked into my house, her face flushed with a mix of frustration and entitlement. I was sitting on my porch, as I often did, enjoying the peace I'd worked so hard to create. The sun had barely begun its descent, casting a soft orange glow over the street. I was finally living the life I dreamed of, a cozy, three-bedroom house nestled in a quiet neighborhood, with a wraparound porch where I could relax after years of working late shifts and putting every spare penny I had into building this home. Emily, Jessica started, her voice brimming with that familiar edge. I need the keys to your house. I blinked, trying to process what I had just heard. She stood there, arms crossed, demanding access to a place that had taken every ounce of my effort to secure. It wasn't the first time Jessica had come to me asking for help. But something about her tone, that sense of entitlement, made it feel different, like she expected me to just hand it all over. I'm sorry. What? I replied, trying to maintain my composure. My heart was already pounding with a mix of anger and disbelief. It's not fair that you have that big place all to yourself while I'm struggling to make rent. She continued, her voice dripping with resentment. You've got 3 bedrooms, a yard, everything you could want. Meanwhile, I'm living in a cramped apartment with my kids, barely scraping by. I stared at her, my mind racing to make sense of what she was asking. She had 2 children now, both of whom were caught in the middle of her constant instability. But my life had been anything but easy. Every bit of this house had come from my own sweat and tears. The down payment was a product of years of overtime shifts, living with roommates to save money, and scrimping wherever I could. I had worked tirelessly to create something stable for myself, something I could be proud of. Jessica, that's my house, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger rising inside me. I worked hard for this. Every penny that went into it came from my own efforts. I'm happy to have you visit. But this is not up for discussion. She scoffed, turning to our parents who were sitting uncomfortably on the couch, watching the exchange unfold. I knew that look, one that meant they were about to take her side. Just like they always had. She had been the golden child, the one who needed more attention, more support, ever since we were young. I, on the other hand, had always been the one who did things on my own, and that had somehow been seen as a reason for me to help her. No matter what I accomplished, it seemed to become a justification for more demands on my time. My money, my energy. Mom, Dad, can you believe this? Jessica said, her voice almost theatrical. I have 2 kids, and Emily's just sitting there in her big house, refusing to help us. It's not fair. I could feel the weight of my parents' gaze on me, the familiar pressure that came when Jessica used guilt as her weapon. My mother, always the peacemaker, began her usual line of defense. Honey, Jessica has a point, she said with that soft, pleading tone that always made my skin crawl. Family should help family. You're doing so well in your career. You've got a big house. And Jessica is really struggling right now. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my temper in check. I'm doing well because I worked for it, I said, my voice tight. I've taken extra shifts, lived with roommates, saved every penny. Jessica is struggling because she refuses to hold down a job for more than 3 months. My mother's expression softened, as if she were trying to comfort Jessica's fragile ego. Jessica's tears welled up, and I knew what was coming next, her classic manipulation tactic. I'm a single mom, she said, her voice cracking, her eyes wide with exaggerated innocence. You have no idea how hard it is. Emily, I don't have anyone to help me. The truth, though, was a little more complicated. Jessica had left her first husband, Tom, a good man who had always supported her through everything. She had left him for a musician who vanished just 2 months later. And now she was on her own, refusing to take any responsibility for her own choices. It was easy for her to play the victim when things didn't go her way. Single by choice, I muttered under my breath. But my father heard me. Sarah Jane Mitchell, he said, his voice booming with authority. How dare you speak to your sister like that? She's going through a difficult time. And you're just sitting here in your big house, refusing to help your family. We didn't raise you to be so heartless. I let out a bitter laugh. No, you raised me to be Amanda's personal safety net. I shot back, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. Every time I accomplish something, it becomes a reason why I should give more to her. When I got into college on a scholarship, you told me that maybe I could help pay for her tuition. When I got my first job, I was expected to pay her car payments. And now that I've bought a house, you expect me to just hand it over? My father's face turned red with anger. That's not what we're saying. Emily, we're asking you to share your good fortune. Share it? I repeated flatly, disbelief coloring my voice. You mean let her live here, rent-free, while I pay the mortgage? Let her kids destroy everything I've worked for? No, absolutely not. Jessica's tears were now streaming freely. And I knew exactly what she was going to say next. I knew it, she sobbed. You've always hated my kids. Just because you're too focused on your career to have a family doesn't mean you should punish mine. The accusation hit me like a slap to the face. I had always wanted children. But I had spent my 20s building a career, hoping that when the time came, I could provide them with the stability that Jessica couldn't offer. She had her first child at 20, with barely a high school diploma to her name. And now she was trying to guilt-trip me into supporting her choices. This discussion is over, I said, standing up, grabbing my purse. I'm sorry you're struggling, Jessica, but my house is not the solution. My father's voice stopped me as I reached for the door. Sit down, Emily, we're not finished here. I turned to face them, my chest tight with the weight of their disappointment. Yes, we are, I said quietly. It's my house, my name on the deed, my mortgage, end of story. But as I opened the door and stepped outside, I had no idea that this would be just the beginning of a battle that would change everything. The days that followed were heavy with tension. The messages from my family poured in, one after another, each more insistent than the last. Aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone had an opinion on how I should handle Jessica's request. Some said I was being cruel, that I was turning my back on family when they needed me most. Others said I should be ashamed of myself, of how cold I was to my sister. But none of them knew the full story. The countless times I'd helped Jessica in the past, only for it to end in disappointment and frustration. I had bailed her out when she couldn't make rent, sent money for her kids' school supplies when she said she couldn't afford it. I'd paid for car repairs and even helped cover her living expenses when she'd lost another job. But nothing was ever enough. She never learned, never took responsibility, and every time, my efforts were met with resentment or, worse, the belief that I owed her more. She had become an expert at making me feel guilty for having worked hard enough to get ahead. I had hoped walking away that day would be the end of it. That I could finally create the space I needed to move forward without the constant weight of her expectations hanging over me. But instead, the pressure only intensified. My phone buzzed constantly. Texts from my mother. Calls from my father. They were relentless, pleading with me to reconsider. Jessica had started crying to them about how hard her life was. About how unfair it was that I was living in a beautiful home while she had to struggle. My parents didn't understand. They were already so deep into enabling Jessica's behavior that they couldn't see how destructive it had become. Then, a week later, I received an unexpected knock on the door. 2 officers stood there, looking uncomfortable. My heart skipped a beat. Miss Clark? One of them asked. We've had a report from your parents stating that you've locked them out of the property. They say you're refusing to allow your sister to move in. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Was this really happening? I had worked hard to secure everything I had. And now they were asking the police to intervene? I stared at them in disbelief before a cold laugh escaped my lips. I have all the documentation showing I bought this house entirely on my own, I said, pulling out the papers that proved it was mine. Every detail meticulously documented. The officers looked at the papers, sighed with relief, and apologized before leaving. But the incident rattled me. My family, the people I had always trusted, were willing to lie to the police to force me into submission. It was a moment of clarity, a realization that they were no longer just asking, they were trying to take something from me. The next day, I came home from work to find Jessica standing in front of my house with my parents and a locksmith. My stomach dropped. What were they doing here? What do you think you're doing? I demanded, stepping out of my car and marching toward them. Family comes first. Emily, my father said, his voice firm. We're taking matters into our own hands. Jessica and the kids need this house more than you do. I could feel my heart racing as the locksmith stood there uncertainly, glancing between us. Ma'am, they said they're the owners, he said, his voice wavering. I am the owner, I snapped, pulling out my phone. And I'm calling the police if you don't leave right now. They didn't argue. The locksmith, looking more than a little uncomfortable, gathered his things and left with my parents and Jessica in tow. As they walked away, I heard Jessica's voice, low but filled with venom. You'll regret this, Emily, when you have nobody left. Remember, it was your choice. Her words hit me harder than I expected. But I didn't let them show. I had made my decision. There was no going back. My boundaries had been crossed too many times, and I wasn't going to let this continue. As the days passed, the guilt started to eat at me. But I reminded myself that I wasn't the one in the wrong. It was my house, my life, and I had the right to protect it. Then came the letter, the one that would change everything. Jessica was suing me for partial ownership of my home, claiming that she had contributed to the down payment. I felt sick. This was the last straw. Jessica had crossed a line. And now she was trying to use the legal system to force me into submission. But I wasn't going to let her win. I called my lawyer, Sarah, and scheduled an urgent meeting. It was time to protect myself for good. The next few days were a blur of legal jargon and paperwork. But I was determined to fight. I couldn't let Jessica manipulate me any longer. Not when she was so clearly willing to destroy everything I had worked for. The more I thought about it, the more enraged I became. The audacity to not only claim that she had contributed to the down payment of my house but to drag our parents into this lie. It was a level of betrayal I hadn't anticipated. Sarah, my lawyer, was calm but firm as we reviewed the case. She told me that Jessica's claim of contributing to the down payment was baseless. In fact, Jessica had borrowed money from me multiple times over the years. And I had records to prove it. The more we dug into the details, the more disgusted I became. Not only was Jessica lying about her role in my house, but she had also convinced our parents to take out a second mortgage in order to fund this frivolous lawsuit. I was furious, but also strangely relieved. At least now I had proof. I wasn't alone in this. As Sarah reviewed the documents and made her plan, she looked at me with a sharp glint in her eyes. We're not just going to defend against this, Emily, she said. We're going to counter-sue for harassment and legal fees. By the time we're done, they'll regret ever taking this to court. Her words gave me a renewed sense of strength. It wasn't just about protecting my house anymore. It was about standing up to the years of manipulation and entitlement that had been allowed to fester in our family. As we prepared for the court date, I found myself bracing for the inevitable fallout. I knew my relationship with my parents would be shattered, and I wasn't sure I could repair it. But I couldn't keep living like this, constantly being dragged down by their blind loyalty to Jessica. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I felt a sense of dread in my chest as I walked into the courthouse. It wasn't just the legal battle that weighed on me, but the emotional one. I knew my parents would be there, sitting on Jessica's side, glaring at me as they had so many times before. They had already chosen her over me time and time again. And I had no illusions that today would be any different. But this time, I was ready. I had something they didn't expect, proof. Inside the courtroom, I sat across from Jessica, who looked more confident than I felt. Behind her were our parents. Their faces grim, but also full of an odd sense of entitlement. They believed this was all part of a bigger plan to get Jessica what she deserved. My father's eyes never met mine, but I could see the tension in his posture. My mother, on the other hand, kept glancing between me and Jessica, her face twisted in a mixture of guilt and confusion. When the judge called the case, Sarah stood up, her voice steady as she presented the evidence that would change everything. One by one, she presented the bank statements, pay stubs, and proof of the years of overtime shifts I had worked to save for this house. It was clear that Jessica hadn't contributed a single dime, and the proof was irrefutable. But Sarah didn't stop there. She dropped the bombshell that would shatter everything. We had proof that Jessica had convinced our parents to take out a second mortgage on their house to fund this lawsuit. The courtroom fell silent as Sarah laid out the details. The judge's face hardened as she listened to the testimony. Is this true, counsel? The judge asked. Turning to Jessica's lawyer. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, then nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The source of my client's legal funds isn't relevant. Oh, it becomes relevant when it demonstrates a pattern of financial manipulation and fraud. Sarah interjected, her voice cutting through the tension. We have evidence that Miss Jessica Clark has a long history of exploiting family members for financial gain. Jessica's face turned pale, her confident demeanor slipping as she realized the gravity of the situation. Our parents looked as though they were about to collapse from the weight of the truth. But nothing could prepare them for what Sarah revealed next. Jessica had lied under oath about contributing to the down payment. Not only had she not helped with the house, but she had also borrowed money from me during that time. Money that was never paid back. The judge turned her gaze to Jessica. Miss Clark, she said, her voice cold. Are you aware that making false statements under oath constitutes perjury? Jessica's eyes filled with tears as she burst into sobs. Her voice high-pitched and frantic. I just wanted what was fair. My sister has everything, and I'm struggling. What's fair? I stood up, unable to remain silent any longer. What's fair, Jessica? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Was it fair when you convinced our parents to risk their retirement? Was it fair when you lied to the police about who owned this house? Was it fair when you tried to break into my home? The judge raised her hand, silencing the room. Miss Clark, please be seated, she said sharply. I've heard enough. Turning to Jessica's lawyer, she added, this case is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential perjury charges. The weight of the moment hit me all at once. Jessica's scheme had crumbled, and with it, the facade that had held our family together for so long. As the courtroom emptied, I could feel the sting of the years of resentment and betrayal. But in that moment, I also knew something had changed, something fundamental. The truth had come out. And with it, I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. As I walked out of the courtroom, a strange sense of peace washed over me. The years of manipulation, guilt, and emotional turmoil had finally reached their breaking point. And I had chosen to stand firm. I had fought for what was mine. Not just in terms of property, but in terms of my own emotional well-being. I wasn't just protecting a house. I was protecting myself from a lifetime of being taken advantage of. The aftermath was explosive. Jessica disappeared after the court case, leaving my parents to deal with the fallout of her actions. I stayed close to them, helping them through their financial struggles, but making it clear that things would never go back to how they were. Boundaries were now in place, and our family was slowly learning what it meant to respect them. A few months later, I received a message from Tom, Jessica's ex-husband. It was a simple thank you, but it meant everything. He said, the kids are doing better with stability. You're welcome to visit them anytime. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope for the future. Months turned into a year, and during that time, Jessica began to rebuild her life, Slowly, carefully, with real effort, she found a job, attended therapy, and started making amends with the people she had hurt. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but there was a genuine change. Family can be complicated, it can be painful, and it can be messy. But sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the most meaningful victories. Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to discover what truly matters. And for me, it was about finally choosing peace, respect, and the boundaries that would allow me to live a life I had worked so hard to build. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories.